I love to write, and I love to write probably more than anything else. But you gotta shut it down at times because it'll eat you alive.
Hey, it's CNF, Creative Nonfiction Podcast, and that, CNFers, is Bob Batchelor, author and editor of no fewer than 645 books. Looking over at my fact checker. It's considerably less than 645, but it's a lot, man. And most recently, The Bourbon King, The Life and Crimes of George Remus, Prohibition's Evil Genius, is why we're here, okay? CNF, the greatest podcast in the world, is sponsored by Bay Path University's MFA in Creative Nonfiction Writing. Discover your story, man, with Bay Path University's fully online MFA in Creative Nonfiction Writing. Recent graduate Christine Brooks recalls her experience with Bay Path's MFA faculty as being, quote, filled with positive reinforcement and commitment. They have a true passion and love for their work. It shines through with every comment, every edit, and every reading assignment. The instructors are available to answer questions, big and small, and it is obvious that their years of experience as writers and teachers have made a faculty that I doubt can be beat anywhere. End of quote. Don't just take her word for it, man. Apply now at baypath.edu/MFA. Classes begin January 21st. Hey, and River Teeth. Can't forget River Teeth, man. A journal of nonfiction narrative. Visit riverteethjournal.com to submit your work and subscribe to the biannual journal. So, looking at my to-do list here, I've got to email Eliza Gabber, email Cassandra King-Conroy, email Glenn Stout, email Kevin Robbins, and riff. Put a check next to that box, CNFers. I'm Brendan O'Mara, and this is CNF, the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories so you can get a little bit better at your own work, drip by drip. I'm always a bit weary about how much I should yammer on in the intro. Should this be part of the show where I show my scars a bit, or do you just want the damn interview? As Tom Petty said, don't bore us, get to the chorus. Here's the thing, I was doing some research for an interview with Baxter Holmes that I plan on doing very soon, and I came across a podcast, The Other 51. I don't understand the title, but the host is a sports media guy, and he gets right to the interview, as does Matt Tullis, who's been on the show before and hosts Gangry the podcast. They waste little time getting to the meat of it. You know, when you see the name in lights, you're there to listen to that guest. You want to dive in and you want to hear that kind of wisdom. Then there's people like Mark Maron who go on for 10 or 15 minutes in an audio blog form. I used to hate that. I used to just skip. But it's actually turned into my favorite part of the show, oddly enough. I'm not sure why, but it just does. And it's that kind of connection, I think. You actually feel like, you know, you're hanging out with the guy, and so in any case, it's really, really grown on me. So with such a glut of podcasts out there, I mean, we've been doing this hot mess for nearly 8 years now. Time and attention is so valuable. So do I want to waste your time by doing exactly this? Or do I want to serve you the interview on the double, Chipotle style? Would you like guacamole with that? This is partly, this right here, of course, is kind of what makes me weird. And in this day and age, my philosophy, if I have one, is you need to double down on what makes you weird. Hence the heavy metal, hence this intro, hence my paralyzing dread and penchant for jealousy and living in pond scum as a donkeyless Shrek, if you will. This is the 174th interview, and I'm still figuring it out. After that great sales pitch, subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Keep the conversation going on Twitter at CNFPod and at Brendan O'Mara. Instagram is at CNFPod and at Brendan O'Mara. The Fifth Estate, Facebook, is at CNF Podcast or the Creative Nonfiction Podcast. Has all my data been mined? You betcha. Head over to BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey. For show notes to this show and the other interviews and the CNF tapas. My Monday Motivation Micropods, usually just 3 minutes to give you that little CNF and kick in the pants as you face the crippling reality of another week of basking in the fluorescent glow of drop ceiling light. Not speaking from experience. So Bob Batchelor is here, and what a treat to spend some time with him. You're going to love his new book about George Remus. Perhaps the exact inspiration of Jay Gatsby. Some speculation there, but definitely cut from a similar fabric. And Prohibition. And his book's The Bourbon King. And you're really going to love Bob. He's got a great story about determination. He really made something of himself when there were people in his life who said he wouldn't amount to anything at all. Certainly didn't think he'd be in the creative fields. He's a great guy, a great writer, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Bob Batchelor. Explicit model to follow or a playbook to follow, and I think that was more true probably 15, 20, 30 years ago, and even predating that. It felt like people who were writing books and maybe getting published in high-profile places were somehow anointed. And it's like, how do you get there? And how did you start to navigate those waters and maybe try to slot yourself into alongside those people that you admired?
That's a great question because I struggled for a long time. I grew up in a college town, so I had a lot of friends whose parents were professors, usually their dad, because I'm a Gen Xer, and at that time dads were profs and moms were teachers. But I didn't come from that side of the track. I came from the wrong side of the track. And I had no role models. I mean, I kind of looked up to some of my friends' dads who had PhDs, and they had lives that I really kind of put on a pedestal. But I had a teacher in high school who everybody revered. And I think a lot of people have that. There's that teacher in high school that you have to get his or her blessing to kind of then go off and pursue something intelligent. And she never gave me her blessing. And in fact, she just didn't like me. And so I probably took about the 4 years that I was an undergrad to figure out that the things that she told me about myself weren't true, because I didn't have a support system, really. I was the first person in my immediate family to go to college. So it was a different circumstance. And so even though I had friends whose parents were highly educated, I didn't navigate that path well myself at all.
What was that teacher saying to you specifically that that you tried to sort of disprove over the course of your collegiate career?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. On one hand, she just flat out said to me, she used to call me Mr. Batchelor just to mess with me. And she'd say, Mr. Batchelor, you are not a creative soul. You better find a job where you can do something else, or you're not going to be successful. She disliked me so much. I had like accelerated English class. She put me in the back of the classroom, again, just to mess with me. I mean, like 5 rows back, like everybody else in the class was up and active, and I was at the back of this classroom. But she had one of those old time paperback spin catalogs in the back of her room, like you'd see in a bookstore. And I was spinning that thing around because I was bored. She had made me look bad in front of class, and it happened to land on a book. And I remember the cover like it was yesterday. It had a basketball on it, and it was blue. And I looked at it, and it said, John Updike, Rabbit Run. And so basically, I stole that book out of her classroom, and I read it, and it was epiphanic in a way because Updike grew up about 300 miles east of me, and I figured this is a lot like my life and what I see around me. And it gave me maybe the first hint that I could become bigger than what people were labeling me as.
Yeah, that's amazing how sometimes a book of that nature or a writer of that nature can kind of unlock things and then maybe start to unroll a path before you. And it sounds like this one particular teacher who was just trying to put her boot on your throat, and then you found a way, you found an outlet in this, and this was like your key. If once you get away from her in that situation, he's like, I can take this and run.
Yeah. And luckily, I had kind of the exact opposite experience. As an undergrad at the University of Pittsburgh, I had this history professor who just took me under his wing probably late in my junior year. And I ended up I could have majored in him. I took probably 6 classes from him. His name is James A. Keel, and he was a great historian. He told me, hey, there's not very many people that come through here that I think should become a historian, but you're one of them. And he pushed me that direction. And maybe I was a little naive at the time because I didn't realize how difficult it was to actually become a historian. I mean, get employed as a historian at a tenure track position at a university. But I went down that path, and luckily, as a master's degree student, I went to Kent State to study under this guy named Lawrence Kaplan, who's one of the top diplomatic historians who ever lived. And he's about to celebrate his 95th birthday next week. And was another just amazing mentor for me. And that era at Kent State, I finally realized that I was smart, and I wasn't just this poor kid from Western PA who didn't have a network and didn't have really much to offer. But it took me until graduate school to really come into my own.
What do you think that particular professor and teacher and mentor recognized in you so early on?
I'd like to think there was a glimmer of the writing there and ability to synthesize some of the history that we were learning. Against my peers, I was probably more excited in his classes, so I worked harder. I was more willing to speak in class, more willing to kind of go out on a ledge whenever he would pose questions. And I can tell you now, as a professor, those students are few and far between. And when you see them, you want to help them if you can, because the world's a tough place. And if you have a little bit of a position as a professor to help a kid out, I think, he knew Western Pennsylvania. He knew the kind of place I was from. I had told him about my upbringing. So I think he was just a good guy and wanted to help me out.
Mm. And speaking of your upbringing, what did your parents do?
Wow. My mom worked 3 jobs basically my whole life just to keep us afloat.
Wow.
Yeah, that's about the stretch of it. It was pretty bad. Let's just say, in the summer, it was okay. In the winter, there was no heat, and I used to sleep with a electric blanket. And to this day, I pull the covers up over my ear because if you left your ear out, it might get frozen in the middle of the night.
Wow.
So
yeah,
it was a fairly rough upbringing. There was a lot of love in the family. I have a good extended family. I had good friends who kind of took me in when I needed it, but it wasn't traditional family life, that's for sure. There was just my mom and my brothers. Really didn't have any male role model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's tough. And I know that some of the people I speak to as well who have sort of rough around the edges upbringings, that sometimes stories and books are ways that they turn to for escape, and that's where they kind of get that bug. Was that true for you at all? That books kind of provided you some sort of refuge?
It's kind of crazy. I had at that time, I had an uncle who was maybe 8 or 10 years older than me. I had people in my life who kind of recognized maybe that I was smart. I played sports. I mean, I was kind of the typical high school jock hero, but it wasn't the person who I actually was. Like, it was a big act. The real person that I was this kind of quiet intellectual, but you couldn't do that. I'm a prototype Gen Xer, and where I grew up, if you were that nerdy bookie kid, you got a good chance of getting beat up by older kids. And until I became, kind of into my own, when my size, I'm big enough that people wouldn't beat me up. I was kind of had to hide that side. So for me, I actually taught myself to read so that I could read Marvel comic books. And it's pretty amazing. 40 years later, I wrote a biography of Stan Lee and got to meet Stan Lee and talk with him and meet a lot of people associated with Stan Lee. And it just all started, back to when I was 4 years old, teaching myself to read so that I could read these words. Then I got into history, probably reading the kids' versions of the Odyssey and the Iliad, and, young adult versions of Jefferson and Washington. This is, an era in which, great white men were still pretty put up on a pedestal. And I liked that biographical stuff. So for me, books were definitely a way to get away, get out. Sports and books, one thing I could do and excel at and people would be excited. The other, at that time, I kind of had to hide.
You've written so extensively on various characters, whether it's, Updike, Gatsby, here we go with Remus in your latest book, and Stan Lee. Have you found through your body of work that you are certain themes and certain maybe archetypes sort of bubble to the surface that you don't even realize until you see the body of work and you're like, wow, I tend to gravitate towards X?
Yeah, definitely. It's really, I don't know. I'm proud of the body of work. I've done some things that I think are pretty special. I've written a bunch of books that I really just wanted to write and went out and found publishers for them. And when I look at the whole body of work, it's really around 20th century American culture. And I don't like the pop culture label all that much because in academia, it's looked down on so much. It's okay for a film scholar to write a film book and they just call themselves a film scholar. But if you call yourself a pop culture scholar in that world of academia, it's really kind of a black mark. So, for me, it's 20th century American culture, and it is about the kind of influences on me that meant something. And so maybe, when you ask me about the body of work, I think this is really my biography unfolded in the books that I write.
I like that. Yeah, I think across when a lot of people, if they take a step back and remove and take a helicopter view of their work, in a sense, even if they're writing about other people, just like you said, it almost becomes a biography of yourself reflected through these other subject matters and in people.
Exactly. When I read John Updike, I know for a fact that he speaks a very specific Pennsylvanian language. And so I know, and I can't prove it, but I just think it, that when I read John Updike, he is singing the song of Pennsylvania to me in a way that I think you have to have lived and grown up in the state to understand. That's special to me. And so, what I owe John Updike, I could never repay. I never met him. Luckily, I've met a lot of members of his family. I've met his children. I know a lot of people who knew Updike, but that book to me was more than just a critical biography. It was almost a love tale that I was sending, a love story from me, this little kid from nowhere, Pennsylvania, to somebody who changed my life without ever knowing it.
And there's something I haven't read Updike extensively, but what I admire about his body of work is that he seemed to be a very fearless writer, and that he wrote nonfiction, he wrote a ton of fiction, he wrote poetry. He just loved language, and that's something I just kind of admire about the guy, that there is a certain amount of courage to constantly put out that kind of work. And I imagine someone like yourself who swam in all of that research, kind of that's really admirable that you could, have that kind of artistic agency and courage and just follow your taste.
Yeah, I think that Updike was a master of words and he loved language. And, I hope, and maybe I'm giving away too much, but when I approached writing The Bourbon King, I tried to think not what would Updike do, but if you could channel a little Updike, your book would be better because Updike's voice is in my head regardless. So why not try to embrace that wonderfulness of that writing and allow it to influence you? I mean, we're all the products of various things and people and ideas and those who we intersect with in life. And that is a big part of who I am. And so I wanted to bring that because you're right, Updike was fearless. If you read his nonfiction, it seems as if he has a PhD or more in whatever. He could write about physics, he could write about modern art in a way that would just profoundly influence the reader, whether that person had spent their whole life studying it or just looking over the article. So that generalist but knowledgeable, that's kind of what I was shooting for and what I've been trying to do in the last couple books specifically.
And as you're sort of taking up the mantle and being under the wing of a very, revered and definitely cherished mentor historian in college, there were probably a couple paths in terms of writing before you, either the traditional historian path, maybe even journalism, or even studying history but writing fiction. At what point did you know which sort of genre you wanted to dance in?
That's a great question. I still don't know if I have the answer to that because I love journalism. I've done tons of long form. I love magazines, but it's just so hard to make a living in these areas. I was living in Cleveland at one time and I got offered a job at a magazine and I would have loved to take the job. And then maybe about 3 weeks later, I got a newspaper job offer and I would have loved to take that job. But both jobs paid about $5 to $7 an hour. And this was late 90s, maybe before the dot-com boom. And I never felt, I still maybe don't feel like I've had the luxury of choosing. I knew that based on my upbringing and my commitments and, my financial life, that I was not probably going to do immersive creative nonfiction, which I love, but I just am not going to be able to jump on the rails and go and I got to have, based on my life, I got to have a job. And so I tried to wiggle my way into jobs like corporate communications and things like that, where I could make enough money to survive, but then freelance on the side. I started writing books in my off hours. So, there were years where I would get up at 4 a.m., write for 4 hours, go to work 8 to 10 hours, come home, write for another hour on my own projects, and then on the weekends, write for 6 or 8 straight hours on Saturday and Sunday. Now, there's an upside to that, which is that you get a lot of work done. But the downside is you're putting in 100-hour weeks. And I mean, I couldn't do that now. 25 years ago, I could pull it off, but I can't do that now. And so college teaching became, for me, a way to get out of the corporate grind and also perhaps loosen my schedule up to the point where I could focus more to what I am now, which is really I'm a writer that teaches versus, say, maybe 10 years ago, I was a professor who wrote because I was maybe going a little bit more down the scholarly path, but it wasn't who I am as a person. I'm closer to that now.
What were some early victories that you can hang your hat on that kind of put juice in your tank, put fuel in your tank to let you know that you weren't completely diluted in your creative pursuits?
That's another great question. Hanging your hat on things. I got really good as a corporate communicator. I became really good at that. but I was also doing pretty well with magazine writing. And I used to live in Cleveland. And so I wrote for this business magazine out of Cleveland. And I used to get a lot of cover stories. And so I realized like I got a knack for storytelling. And I could bring this into some of the kind of quasi scholarly writing I was doing and make a go of it. And so to me, it was really the focus on storytelling. And I was getting enough interest, and people were telling me how good the things I was doing were at the time, that I just wanted to keep pushing it. And some of the early books that I wrote were kind of quasi-academic, but I was writing them to the best of my ability and getting some response, even though, like the first book I wrote was this history of the 1900s, like just the 1900 to 1910 era. And it allowed me to kind of show off my research abilities, but then write it in a way that, that people were responding to. And that book took off in kind of the quasi-academic, smart library reader market. And from that, it just snowballed. That book sold really well. And the publisher, which is a big kind of quasi-academic publisher, the editor and I there hit it off pretty well. And he would just say to me, what do you want to write next? So I could start tackling things.
Mm. And I know, John McPhee, who's a hero of mine, and he's got to be 90 or 91 at this point, but he teaches most of the year, and he's done this for decades. He would teach his 9 months out of the year, and then usually the summer, and that would be like his fallow writing time, so to speak. And then the summers is when he would pursue any of the topics that struck his taste, which led to, 40 books or so, and very long New Yorker articles.
Yep.
And so to that point, how do you, or how have you learned to ration your writing energy and your teaching energy so they might feed each other instead of maybe pirate off of one another?
Wow, another great question. So many good questions, Brendan. You're it's like you're reading my mind. You're reading the innermost like little closets of my mind that I've shut off because I have never wanted to fully contemplate them. So, bravo for that.
Hey, thank you.
The teaching is, so in January it'll be 15 years that I've been teaching full time, and it's really, I want to say easy for me, but it's not easy. I'm good in front of the class. I have a lot of stories from my life as a communicator, and I'm teaching communications. I'm teaching today's students who want to go into marketing to be ethical, to be smart about what they're doing, to be conscientious consumers and creators of culture. And so I have a lot of stories about that because I had a pretty successful career in that field. So I say that it's easy for me, but it's not easy at all. I mean, it's built off a long hours of hard work and working hard to keep up with the reading across fields and things like that. So the work that I do as a writer, I don't know, it's so important to me that I never really take time away from it. I'm always reading for the next thing, or I'm always writing or always doing research. I guess I'm lucky that I still, knock on wood, I still have a lot of energy, and I write pretty fast. I'm pretty good at research, so I know where to go to find things. I don't know if I have to divvy it up as much as McPhee does. And I have some friends who teach who they do about the same thing. During the school year, they're locked down pretty hard on teaching and grading and all that. But then in the summer, they do most of their work. I don't think I need that kind of division because in my past, I never had the luxury of a division. Everything kind of blurred together. So I think the one thing that I would tell listeners is that over the years, what I've been able to do is really get in touch with my own writing process. And I think people don't want to go down this path, I mean, you really have to analyze yourself, your strengths and weaknesses, and be honest. I know what gets me from one paragraph to the next. And I devised a process about 15 years ago that I use every single time I sit down. And so I've never had writer's block. I never can't write because I am the master of my process. And so when I'm ready to go, it's both barrels, full speed ahead.
So what is that process, and what were the steps or how you arrived at it, I should say? Like, what is the process and how did you arrive at it?
Sure. The history of the process for me was that as a young kind of budding academic, one of the ways that you got training back then, and it doesn't even work anymore. I don't think people do this anymore, but you would write small reference book essays, and you would write things that were maybe 200 words, 500 words. Then I would start to write, magazine sidebar pieces that were maybe 800 words, front of the magazine kind of stuff. And gradually I worked up to where 1,500 to 3,000 words became the norm and very manageable. And then from 3,000 word cover story to 5 or 8,000 word journal article or chapter, that becomes really manageable. So as I sat down and started thinking about, what keeps people from getting words on the page, I look at it very mathematically. I'm working on a book right now, and I know that each chapter can only be 4,500 words because it's a illustrated history book. I think it's going to really do well in the marketplace, but it's 50,000 words total. It's 300 plus illustrations and images. So the chapters are shorter than, say, in the Bourbon King, where it's usually 8 to 10,000 word chapters. If I have 4,500 words, I know that basically I'm going to make like 4 major points. So I break those sections up for, basically with an intro and a concluding piece of each chapter. We're down to, 1,000 word each, if that. And then I start to think, well, if I'm going to make 3 points within each one of those larger subsections, now we're down to 300 words, maybe a little less there. When I sit down to write, I think, well, I can't just sit down today and write 4,500 words. Maybe I haven't done enough research to get to that point, or there's some things that I haven't figured out yet. But I know that I can write 300 words. And so I start to build it out, and I keep a running total of the words. And as soon as I get a new project, I start writing. Even if the research hasn't even really gotten past like the proposal stage, I start writing right away and then use the technology to, I'll start a chapter folder on Word, and I'll move things around, and I'll put like, if I know something's going to be added to chapter 3, I'll make a little file, use the technology to help me in this process of like boiling everything down to its smallest piece, and then blasting through those pieces and worrying about tidying it all up later. Because it's daunting to write a 65,000 word novel or a 110,000 word history book, when you're competing with David McCullough for the reader's mind space, that's going to make anybody swallow hard. But if I can boil it down to 200 words and get my 200 words out and then see where I'm at, get 200 more, you don't have to do that many times during a day before you've had a really successful day.
Yeah, and I find that working backwards from a goal and then doing the math over the course of that time span really works. And it's to your point of like taking these small bites, and these small bites add up. I find that really makes it so digestible and approachable. Like, yeah, it's 65,000 words. It's like, oh shoot, how am I gonna write that? But if you have 3 months and you divide that by 90 days and so forth. Yep. And then maybe even breaking it down to maybe a little in the morning and a little at night, that might add to that might be 150 words in the morning and then 150 at night. And all of a sudden you're developing some real momentum.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, it's just been relentless production for a really nice little decade-long sprint here. Because as an academic, I got really good at putting together edited volumes where I'd get, I'd actually come up with the whole thing myself, all the contents, but then farm out chapters. So we'd have this cool anthology in which I'd be the editor, and maybe I'd get somebody to co-edit it with me, get the publisher, then go back and, so I know this guy, he's a Michael Chabon scholar. He'd love to write his piece, and then so put these things together. And I ended up doing about, I don't know, maybe 15 or 18 of those books in addition to the books I'm writing. And then I got hooked up with a publisher the publisher who published the Stan Lee book, Roman and Littlefield. They're one of the largest independents. They do trade books. They do mainly scholarly, kind of quasi-readable scholarly stuff. And I became a book series editor there. And we put out 5 different book series. So one of the book series was Contemporary American Fiction. Another one was Cultural History of Television. So I would start to farm out books to other writers and academics in that role. And I would end up not only being the acquiring editor, but then also helping them as the writing process kicked in if they needed help. And then I would always read the book at the end and do a little copy editing. So I ended up putting out about 25 books in those 5 book series. So when I look back, we're talking earlier about the mass of work that's come out. It's so much. There's just so much there, and I feel like every piece I've learned more about myself as a writer, about voice, about what's important, what readers might find important. And one of my buddies was joking with me. He's like, "You're probably the most prolific Gen X scholar in the world. Just not enough people have heard of you yet." So that's kind of his running joke with me. But I don't know if that's true or not. But I put out the words, and I try to help other people put out the words, and it gives me a good vibe to know that I'm giving back to the world.
Yeah, and the one of the things that I always love looking at, especially when I pick up a book like the Bourbon King, and I flip to the back, and I love seeing the amount of research a writer himself or herself has done on their own or as a team. I suspect you did this all on your own. Just the titanic amount of research that goes into creating a narrative of this nature. And to that point, in the age of Google, where research can feel almost too easy and even a little lazy with Google, how have you developed your research muscle and maybe found some other ways and creative ways to curate information that allows you to bring a story to life?
Yeah, with the Bourbon King, I would love to say that I did this all on my own, but my wife, Suzette, is an amazing researcher. And there were parts of it that, yeah, definitely I did my own. But one of the things that I set out to do with the Bourbon King, because there's a lot of legend about George Remus in the 1920s that people think they know, or, for instance, people would say that George Remus was the inspiration for The Great Gatsby. And, that's not true, but journalists would use it. People in the tri-state area around Cincinnati would use that as kind of a shorthand catch-all. And so doing the research, and one of the things we did was walk the areas. And so the one of the protagonists in the Remus story is this guy, Franklin Dodge, that Imogene Remus runs off with. I mean, this is the love triangle in the heart of the book. And we went to Lansing, Michigan, and because he was from a prominent family, the house is still there. It's a house museum in Lansing. It's owned by the Parks Division of the city now. And we went there and we uncovered a lot of archival stuff that had never been used, pictures. And I stood in his bedroom. So there's a little section in there. It's maybe one sentence. I talk about Dodge's family. There's this musical family. They had on the 3rd floor this giant room that was like the dance room. So when they would have guests, which included very prominent politicians like William Jennings Bryan. Dodge's mom would play piano because she was a concert level pianist, and the family would dance up there and they would have holiday parties. And so it gives a little sense of who this guy was and his background. And the reader's got to wonder, like, why would this upstanding, well-to-do guy turn so dark and essentially become, an undercover bootlegger when he's supposed to be a prohibition officer? So we never could have done that if we wouldn't have tracked back and, had the wherewithal to go to Lansing and spent some time there and walked in their shoes. So for me with this book, the research was not only on the computer, it was in archives. There are a lot of small archival places that we went to, like this House Museum. And then I tracked down the court transcripts for not only for Remus's main trial, but all of his insanity hearing trials after that. There's one copy. It's at the Yale Law Library. And Charlie Taft, who was another Remus's protagonist, the son of William Howard Taft, who was president and then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Taft donated his copy of the transcripts, which are bound and at Yale. And so I went through them, and I got them through special collections. Yale was kind enough to send them to Miami University's special collections department, and I spent, every spare minute of 6 or 8 months scanning those documents. And there are probably 5,000 to 7,000 pages of court transcripts. So to me, it was pulling together all these resources electronically, which I could do because we have access to so many newspapers, but then also hitting the ground, throwing a little Bob Caro kind of research into it, and then also going to places where people maybe didn't fit all the pieces together in the past when they talked about Remus. And so that's how I really tackled it.
And when you're at, say, a house museum and you're there and you're getting access to the ungoogleable things because you're you're scuffing up your boots on the pavement to get to some of these places, what's a conversation you might be having with the volunteer at the desk? Are you saying, where else can I find information? Who might be the next domino in this chain?
Yeah, we joke about that all the time because Suzette is an amazing person, and she's much more personable than me, and she usually gets the secret sauce. And so I'll be flying through some paperwork or trying to find those keys in the documents, while at the same time she's usually talking to the volunteers or the director who runs the place. And it's almost as if once you're there and you prove like you're serious about what you're doing, then the secret file comes out, or the thing that we never show anybody else comes out. And all of a sudden, at the end of the day or the end of days or the end of a week or however long you have, you think back and like, holy mackerel, we have stuff that nobody's seen before, nobody's talked about. We have these little pieces because we were willing to go down this path, and we're very good at tag teaming on those instances to really get at the secret files that they don't really want to show you.
I love that. I love that you're like this, like a tag team tandem, kind of like you said, and to get this information, and then when you get that, this panning for gold, so to speak, and you've got like this nugget that no one is seeing, or no one's doing the legwork to get that into their notebook, or take a picture or scan things, however you approach it and curate this stuff. Like that's got to be like this great electric charge when you come across that kind of stuff.
Oh, it is. And it's my historian, kind of goosebumps go crazy whenever this happens, because with this story, it's such a big story. I mean, I've done a couple long interviews. I've spoken about the book at a dozen different places. And usually people say to me, the first thing they say is, I can't believe I don't know this story. I don't know the George Remus story. The second thing they say is, why isn't this on Netflix or on a TV show? The third thing they say is, you're fooling me. You made this up. And I'm like, I didn't make this up. It's a real story. It's just so complex and so deep. And just when you think Remus has run his last con, there's another piece that comes out of nowhere. And so to pull all this information together, I mean, to tell you the truth, maybe my editor Keith Wallman at Diversion wouldn't want me to tell you this, but I'll tell you anyhow. The book was probably only supposed to be maybe 2/3 as long as it is, but I kept coming across so much more information, and the story was so much bigger that I just kept writing, and I would have these conferences with Keith, and I'm like, hey, this story is bigger than even we thought when we started down this path. And so thankfully, Diversion was really good about saying, hey, tell the story. And of course we cut when we had to, but thank goodness in this day and age where every page means more money for the publisher, they were willing to go where it needed to go.
And what's especially what struck me about the book too, just in terms of how it just the story itself developed, and you can tell it stems from all that gold that you got from those transcripts from the Yale special sections library, is just when you can get dialogue into narrative nonfiction, like historical narrative nonfiction, like that is the stuff that just makes this thing really pop. That must have been really fun for you to come across like actual dialogue, actual things of back and forth between people that really elevated this story, that made it come alive in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's one of the things where I think, my lifelong devotion, at least, as long as I've known, even in the back of my mind, I want to be a writer someday, creative nonfiction's been my thing. I could have easily went down a different path where I was a novelist, but to be honest, there's so many people who elevate the novel and think you're not really a quote unquote writer unless you write novels. And to me, that's just a silly concept. Use all your powers as a writer to write good stuff and what interests you. And to me, biography, history, historical context means so much. So to find the sources in which Remus is talking, luckily both he and Dodge were manipulating the media, and the newspapers were pushing them off against one another. So there's a lot of dialogue. These two guys were having a conversation. These two men who hated each other and came to blows and wanted to kill each other, they were having an ongoing warfare across the biggest newspapers in America, who were eating this stuff up because it was an era in which newspapers were highly, highly competitive. And it just made for such an ability. I felt like I was just the medium for this story. It was, my literary and historical detective work, kind of having a sense of what needed to be told, putting in its context. But these guys were like screaming, and Imogene Remus as well. These people were screaming from beyond the grave for me to tell this story.
And how did you arrive at the structure of the book? It opens up, of course, with in the moments after Remus, shoots his wife dead in the street in broad daylight, and that's the prologue. And then, of course, we start getting his backstory, and and then it unfolds from there. I suspect you had some artistic choices to make in terms of how you structured this book. So I wonder, like, what was some of that dialogue that you were having with yourself about this?
Definitely. There was a lot of dialogue going back and forth because, to tell you the truth, I don't like straight chronology. And I think my feeling is I wanted to write this as almost, the longest screenplay possible. That was what I was going for. And what I like about movies is when there's flashbacks and you get context as people think. Because in our everyday lives, what makes it interesting isn't the moment to moment. What makes it interesting is how we look back and try to project forward. People don't necessarily just live in the moment. They're constantly ping-ponging and pinballing these ideas of like their past and what they see in the future. So I wanted to include some of this in the book, and probably, another. Keith was not always super happy with my lack of chronological events, but I think that readers, particularly the kind of reader who's going to pick up the Bourbon King, I think they're going to dig it more than they're not going to dig it, because this is the way life unfolds. It's not a straight circle or a straight arrow from one point to another. And for me, Remus's entire life changed in a way that he couldn't anticipate in those seconds after he pulled the trigger. And so to me, if I'm, I don't know. I don't know if you've seen the movie Little Big Man. I saw that at the drive-in when I was a little kid. It just had a profound impact on me. It's Dustin Hoffman. He lives. It's a Thomas Berger novel that's adapted in the mid '70s, and it's basically almost like Forrest Gump before Forrest Gump, and that just had a profound impact on me because the character is over 100 years old, and he's looking back like he was at Custer's Last Stand, all these different events in American history, particularly in the West. And I don't know. I love to tell a non-chronological story.
Yeah, there's a point, probably about halfway through the book, where I thought you did that really well. It's right after Remus he's locked up in the Big A, and you're wondering what's happening here, and then there's this flashback to him speaking with Imogene and giving her power of attorney over his various estates and everything across his empire, which of course is like the tinder that really sets off the next half of the book as Dodge and Imogene are then have their illicit affair and then try to basically gut everything Remus had while he spent his about 2 years in prison.
Yeah, which one of the things I've never even really talked about in some other interviews I've done. There's an entire chapter called, it's something, it's Assassins, Cutthroats and Assassins, because for a good 6 months, Remus and on one side, and then Franklin Dodge and Imogene Remus on the other, they're hiring real murderers. I mean, some of the biggest kind of cutthroats in American history at that time, they're hiring these gangs, competing gangs, to kill the other group. It's shocking that they never really were able to do it. I think in some senses the media glare would have been so intense if a gang member would have killed Remus, they would have probably almost guaranteed been caught. And so the media in some ways saves Remus's life because he was too much of a celebrity to be murdered. And it's really interesting to me how these pieces they just come out of nowhere, and there are moments in which these different characters couldn't see what was going to happen, and I really wanted those to pop for the reader because history is all about context, and if you put yourself back in that time, there were big events that started with these little tiny moments.
Yeah, and speaking of context, of course, the backdrop is the Volstead Act and Prohibition. In your research, of course, you've spent a lot of time swimming in Gatsby, and then, of course, this is like a nonfiction sort of Gatsby adjacent story, if you will.
Yep.
What was that like? Just in terms of the context of Prohibition, like what is 100 years later, what do you make of that? And that the fact that the country had come to a certain point with the 18th Amendment to actually, do away with alcohol, which of course just led to a lot of illicit activity and very charismatic people to take advantage.
Of course, my publisher and I mean, we wanted this book because it's the 100th anniversary of Prohibition. That's a given. You have to have these kind of hooks in today's. I mean, unless you're David McCullough and you can write about whatever you want. I mean, You have to be smart about the topics that you choose. So while I'm writing the book, it's clear that we are still dealing with the consequences of Prohibition, and maybe in all of its forms today. We're still dealing with presidential corruption. I mean, it's right in our faces. And Harding luckily for him, he died before the full truth came out, because Harding was, I don't know, depending on who you believe, either a total dupe or a criminal mastermind. And so I thought that as we celebrate 100 years, there's still a lot to be learned from Prohibition and from the Roaring '20s, that if readers look at the Bourbon King, they will start to see these pieces, and maybe it may change to some degree how they think about what we're going through today. I mean, knock on wood, it doesn't end with another great, depression like it did at the end of the '20s. I mean, that would, I hope that I'm not the Bourbon King's not a crystal ball, because I do not want that for any of us. But, there's a lot of writing on the wall, and I spent a lot of time in the Bourbon King bringing that context to life at the time, so the reader would really get a full picture.
And what do you think is the appeal of the Jazz Age and the Roaring '20s, even from 100 years later, and why we are? I read Great Gatsby every year in December. I read once a year. It's kind of like an anniversary thing for me, and I love the book to pieces, of course, and it's been adapted into movies and everything. There's something to be said about the allure of that era, and I wonder, since you've spent so much time there, so to speak, what do you think the appeal is, even to this day?
Yeah, yet another thing you and I share, Brendan, because I read The Great Gatsby again at least once a year, because I can't put it down. I think at last count, I've read it 147 times, I think.
Wow.
And it's one of those, it's a guidepost for me mentally. I have to do it. And what I found, both really, and this comes back to the research, people love that Gatsby-esque. They love the parties. They've built the idea of what is Gatsby like, or, as you mentioned quite astutely, Gatsby adjacent in their minds, because of the films and because we've mythologized it as part of the American dream and this wonderful time. But on the other hand, people hate the 1920s. So a lot of stuff that I really hoped to find at the beginning of the research, I found out had simply been destroyed. Even Imogene's dress was one of the pieces of evidence that they showed in the trial. And so when I went to the county clerk of courts, I'm trying to track down all these pieces of evidence. And I have a secret contact. I mean, maybe he's not going to be so secret now, but I have a contact in the office, and he tells me, that stuff was just destroyed because people wanted to bury the 1920s. The 1920s here in the Cincinnati area was a black mark. And one of the things readers will see is that Remus got on the bad side of the Taft family, and it was almost a precursor to what was going to happen to him. This was the most powerful family in the city, one of the most powerful families in the United States. You couldn't cross them. And so we love the 1920s. I mean, this next decade is going to be nothing but Gatsby weddings, Gatsby New Year's parties. I mean, I'm already seeing it on Facebook, listing for Gatsby events, because that revelry part we all love, but people don't want to talk about the 1920s in terms of Prohibition. So it's a really strange thing. I saw it in my research, where you'd expect something would be available and is gone. It not just gone, but obliterated. And it's a very interesting facet of how we think about this dark mark on American history.
Yeah, and there's something to be said too of the romanticism of that era, specifically, James Gatz, and then Remus. That these are people who are on the fringe of society, coming from quite literally nothing, and then through sheer force of will are able to actually make something of themselves. And I think that's always going to be something timeless in this country, especially.
Yeah, and Remus, I think is interesting. Everybody knows Al Capone. You go anywhere in the world and you say Capone, people are going to know what you're talking about. It's amazing. But Capone was a career criminal, and Remus's story couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, Remus was this upstanding pharmacist, then really the top criminal defense attorney in America, and if not all of America, at least one of the top 2 or 3 in the country. And you have to ask yourself, why would a guy like this turn? And that's really part of that central thesis of the Bourbon King, is how would this guy turn to become one of the real criminal masterminds in American history, along with why we don't know who he is today. So, yeah, that American dream facet of or factor of the 1920s, it's really caught people's attention.
Mm. Yeah, and we're coming up against our hour here, and I feel like I could. I'm happy you have more work coming out, and you have work in the past, because I want to keep having these kind of conversations. This is fascinating to me. I didn't prompt you when I emailed you. I forgot to, but you've been listening. You've listened to McDougal, and you've been listening the last few weeks, so maybe you have something ready. I've been asking people for a recommendation of sorts to kind of close things out, to maybe unplug, take mind off of the daily grind. And I wonder if something comes to mind, like what might you recommend to people out there, just as something to unplug from?
Well, I'll tell you what, Brennan, I am a very lucky man, because in later life, I have found the woman of my dreams, and Suzette and I unwind by traveling and going to, these kind of vintage flea markets, and we like to go to cool bars. And when we're there, we just like to talk, and we talk to people, and the next thing you know, you have like a little mini party going on, and you're meeting interesting people, because even though we as writers market and traffic in this existential nightmare of jealousy and rage and loneliness and anxiety, I actually do like to get out amongst the people, because everybody's so complex and everybody has a story, and I love the stories. So we do a lot of this going out and meeting people. And one of the other things that we really like to do, we have this, our favorite jazz band is this group called the Hot Sardines. They're out of Brooklyn, and they do music basically 100 years ago, and they travel around the world, and we try to go see them when they're within a couple 100 miles of here. And so we have as much fun when I'm not sitting here in my office and it's semi-dark and it's really quiet. So when it's not that time, we try to do just the opposite, whether it's, having a bottle of Prosecco and singing 1980s songs at the top of our lungs, or going out amongst the people. I mean, just trying to get that existential dread out of the middle of my forehead and experience something different. So that's what I would say to people. I mean, I love to write, and I love to write probably more than anything else outside of my family. But, you got to shut it down at times, because it'll eat you alive.
Oh, that's amazing. And Bob, where can people get more familiar with your work if they're not already familiar with it?
Sure. The easiest thing is my website, which is just my name, bobbatchelor.com. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter at Cult Pop Culture. And I'm active on social media. I mean, I like engaging with readers. I've had, since the book came out, a couple people who knew Remus. I've had some Remus family members who are kind of distant cousins reach out to me. So there's a lot of people who have bootleg stories, and they like to tell them. And I'll tell you the truth, I love to hear them. So it's easy. It's just Bob at bobbatchelor.com. It couldn't be more simple to get in touch with me. And unlike I am eternally grateful to people who spend the time reading my stuff. So I love getting those kind of emails from people.
Fantastic. Well, this was a ton of fun to get to finally talk to you about your work and this great book that you've written. And we've been back and forth a lot on Twitter and in email. So this was a thrill, and I hope this is the first of many conversations we have going forward, Bob.
Yes, Brendan, I'm a huge fan, and I consider myself a CNFer, and I will continue to listen. And when this posts, I'm going to share it with all my friends and family, because I think maybe this is the most I've ever talked about my writing life at one time, and maybe dug through some holes in my brain that I haven't contemplated before. So I appreciate the time. It's really been a fun time today.
And now we come to the part of the show where I take off my cardigan, take off my blue canvas boating shoes, sing you a song, and leave the neighborhood. That was fun. Thanks to Baypath and Riverteeth for the support, of course. Be sure to head over to BrendanO'Mara.com, hey, to sign up for the monthly newsletter. It could turn into a weekly newsletter to coincide with the podcast publishing on CNN Friday. I don't know. For now, once a month, no spam. Can't beat that. Link up to the show on social media and tag the show so I can give you digital fist bumps and devil horns, perhaps a little skull. If you dig the show, consider leaving a kind review on Apple Podcasts. They have flatlined of late. Haven't had a new one in months. I'd love to reach 100, and we're stuck on 79. And as of this recording, that could all change because of you, man, because of you. There's 21 of you out there, right? Maybe not. We'd love to get to 100. I say we, but it's just me. Show today was edited, produced, booked by yours truly, Brendan O'Mara. Intern, Brendan O'Mara. So, whatever. If there's one thing I've learned, if you can do interviews, see ya!